over 120 empty lots were in the Bronx, and this was their first drawdown. How many people like salsa? Sometimes it just come off like that. Why should you be, forbidden from growing your own food?
Where money is flowing is not where we want it to flow. And I'm committed to facilitate the reallocation of money away from uses of fear, destruction, overconsumption, destroying our environment, to reallocating that money to love, life, the preservation of life, the health and well-being of our children, the health and well-being of our communities, the health and well-being of all children of all species for all time.
Please welcome New York Society for Ethical Culture leader, Dr. Ann Clayson.
Good evening, and welcome to the New York Society for Ethical Culture. You'll find some information about the Society in your program, and I hope you'll also stop at our table out front in the lobby and get more information as well, including our newsletter. Ethical Culture was founded in 1876 by Felix Adler, who turned the notion of traditional religion on its head. Instead of requiring a doctrinal creed, he proposed that we put ethics at the center of our lives, regardless of whatever religious beliefs we may have been taught. When you go into our lobby, you'll see over on that end a quotation. It reads, "Deed above creed." And that reminds us that we must always walk our ethical talk. Ours is a humanistic philosophy that emphasizes taking responsibility for the consequences of our actions and partnering with individuals and groups who share our values so that together we can make the world a better home for everyone. And today, more than ever, we are committed to supporting and promoting action on climate change. So, I want to welcome you here to this time and space that we say we make sacred, that when people come together to seek the highest, we create holy ground together. I want to welcome Bill Mckibben back to this stage because he was here with us on September 20th, 2014, as we were part of the People's Climate March, and you shared this stage with other notables, including Mary Robinson and Lester Brown. Environmental ethics is an important part of our social justice mission, and we provide support for events like these and also for educational programs and for panels. You may have noticed that the banner that we have on Central Park West reads, "One planet, one chance." I also want to draw your attention to an ongoing program that we've had for over 3 decades, and that's our shelter for homeless women downstairs. So if you can volunteer to be a volunteer in our shelter, we would very much appreciate it. Please go on our website, ethical.nyc, and you will find information there. So now, it's such a great honor to welcome you back up to the stage, Bill. So Bill will now set up our program. Wow, you jumped right up here. Wonderful.
Wow. And thank you so much, and thank you for making this place available. It is wonderful to be back. The last time we were here, it was hours before the great climate march in 2014, which I have no doubt many people here were a part of. 400,000 people surging down Central Park West and 6th Avenue. That was a great day, and that was a great evening, and this will be a great evening. And the reason that I'm going first is because I'm the depressing part that we're going to get out of the way. Everybody else here is extremely upbeat, optimistic, at work, ready to go. And I am too, but I'm just going to tell you about what I did with my summer vacation. I went up to do some work, actually, in Greenland for a few weeks in August. And, I wrote the first book about climate change 30 years ago next year. I've been working on it my whole life. I've seen 1,000 examples of people being hurt every day. We turn on the TV or the internet and see another example. Right now we should be keeping in our hearts our brothers and sisters in North Carolina who are still dealing with the aftermath of what was the biggest rainstorm in the history of the East Coast. And those of us who lived through Sandy, that's saying something. But it was remarkable to be in Greenland and watch in real time as the great ice sheet calved one iceberg after another off into the North Atlantic. Just the rapid disintegration of the one Earth that we've got is a remarkable thing for any of us to really take in, for any of us to really understand at some visceral level, because, the Earth seems to us large and stable. Our civilizations are all that we've ever known, and the thought that it's at some kind of profound risk now, disintegrating, is hard to take in. But we need to, and then we need to ask the questions about what we're going to do about it. And that's why tonight is such an important and delightful moment. When my old friend Paul Hawken called me up to tell me about the project he was undertaking that years later would turn into Drawdown, I of course was really pleased. Paul's been a visionary for a very long time and an old and dear friend, and helped as best I could with the parts that I knew a little about. But it became, as the years went on, a remarkable project, one really without parallel, an effort to bring together all that we know about how we might fix things. And it's a great deal of both technical knowledge and knowledge about humans and their institutions and how they work and what might be possible. And so it's one of those rare and kind of epochal documents, and happily it's been received that way. Around the world now, people are taking seriously the possibilities outlined in not only the book, but the large suite of seminars and educational opportunities and websites and everything else that have gone with it. And you're going to hear more and more about that this evening. It's one part now of what's emerged as a set of broad solutions, some of them technical, some of them political, some of them economic, that are giving us, at the very least, a chance at dealing with this greatest calamity that humans have ever wandered into. But that realizing that chance, taking advantage of it, is going to require all of us doing all that we can on every possible front. I was really happy to see as I walked in, not only some of my colleagues from 350.org around the world, and Pyle and Conson and Hoda and Lindsay. It's very good to see you guys here. Thank you so much for your work, especially for helping coordinate these amazing rallies. And from 10 days ago, the Rise, they had 900 big rallies around the world, and thank you so much for that work, all of you. And to see the crew from 350 NYC, who have been absolute stalwarts in this fight for a long time. What made me happiest, since organizing should never stop, even for a moment, was to see that they were busy handing out postcards there in the lobby, addressed to the Comptroller of the State of New York, Thomas DiNapoli. I see that we're calling him Tom now, and that's good. It's good that we're on a familiar basis with him and more all the time. We need the state of New York to do what the city of New York did. You'll hear the story of the city of New York from Dan Zerilli in a little while, but we need the state of New York to divest its $200 billion in holdings in fossil fuels, and we need them to do it now. So make sure that you fill out that postcard and put a stamp on it and put it in the mail. And, you know, when we sent 2,500 postcards from Carnegie Hall last year to the Comptroller of the City of New York, Scott Stringer, it wasn't but 6 weeks later that the City of New York decided to divest. So we have a big, I know everybody's used by now to, you all want to, you know, Insta-chat and snap message and tweet each other and so on, but once in a while, just actually sending a postcard is a good thing, you know. If you haven't done it, you can ask one of the older people in the audience how it's done, you know, what it is you do to make it work. Before we learn more about Drawdown, though, we need someone to come up and provide the necessary antidote to my mild gloom. It is really true that my job for 30 years has basically been to bum people out, and I've gotten good at it, and I apologize, and I feel quite all right about it tonight because, among other things, we have Lynn Twist to sort of take us in the next direction. Lynn is a renowned global activist. She leads workshops, she writes books like The Soul of Money, but probably most importantly, she helped found the Pachamama Alliance. Now, the Pachamama Alliance is a real and powerful presence in the fight, not only for environmental rights, but for human rights, for a working planet that works in every way. And one of the insights, I think, most importantly, that we've learned over the last 10 or 15 years is that it's pointless to try and divide out the environment as a kind of separate category in which to work, inextricably linked to questions around human rights and indigenous rights and everything else for these questions that we come up against. The Pachamamas Alliance purpose is to bring forward an environmentally sustainable, spiritually fulfilling, socially just human presence. They've worked to conserve millions of acres with indigenous people in the Amazon rainforest. And Lynn, well, you saw the picture of her up there with Oprah. Her reach is enormous. Countless people throughout the world, programs in 80 countries in 20 languages over the years, things like this Drawdown course that we hope that some of you will register for tonight. Lynn is a force in the world, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Lynn Twist.
Particularly, thank you, Bill Mckibben, for waking up millions and millions and hundreds of millions of people on this planet in such a powerful way. I think we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to you and 350.org. So the Pachamama Alliance, as Bill said, is really a project that comes out of the Amazon, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, who are the custodians of these magnificent forests and who have a really clear and deep resonance with what's happening in the world today. And the Pachamama Alliance is a partnership, an alliance between indigenous peoples of the Amazon, particularly the Sacred Headwaters region of the Amazon, which is in southern Ecuador and northern Peru, and conscious, committed people in the modern world like all of you here and all the people listening to this live streaming for the sustainability of life itself. And our competency and what we bring to the very, very important issues of our day is to really create transformational educational experiences that shift the way people see themselves, their relationship with the natural world, their relationship with one another, their relationship with future generations, and the sustainability of life, waking people up to their natural responsibility, their natural love for this planet, for all forms of life, and for future generations. And that competency is something that we do through courses all over the world, as Bill said. But what I want to say is that having people be able to see that they can make a difference allows people who are apathetic, who have lost hope, who feel that there's nowhere to go and they can't face this giant thing called global warming, climate change. It's just too big for me. I can't figure out what to do about it. It's overwhelming, it's hopeless, it's inevitable. What are we going to do? And they just do the best they can to ignore it. Our job is to wake people up, particularly people who are apathetic, particularly people who've lost their hope, particularly people who can't see their way to take action. And so I must say that global warming is so gigantic, so upsetting. The news keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Things are going faster than anyone predicted, that it's easy to kind of want to go numb to it. It's easy to kind of go back into the trance. And I must say that even for myself, there are times when, even though I'm kind of in charge of creating possibility for people, that I can't find the possibility myself. But in April, I think it was, of 2017, when I got a call from Paul Hawken saying that this book was getting released called Drawdown. And he sent me an early copy, maybe it was January, I can't remember, but early 2017. And he started to tell me about what Drawdown was and what had come out of the research that had been done for years and years with over 200 experts and scholars and scientists that Katharine and Chad are going to talk about tonight. And he said, you know what? We can reverse global warming. We can reverse it. Not just mitigate it, not just try to slow it down, not just avoid it, being totally at the effect of this thing much bigger than us. We think we can actually reverse it. We created it as a human species, and we can turn it around completely. Now, it's not going to be easy, but we can do it. That's kind of the revelation of the research. And I started to cry, actually, because I needed it. I needed that tonic. I needed to be able to see the way through. I was beginning to get discouraged myself, even though I'm in charge of the possibility of life. You know, that's kind of my job at the Pachamama Alliance. And I remember being in tears over this phone call. And then when he sent me the workup of the book, it wasn't quite published yet, and I started reading the introduction, and I started looking at the exquisite photographs and the 100 solutions, which you'll hear about tonight. I was just, it was like water to the desert for a person like me. And so the Pachamama Alliance, we picked this thing called Drawdown up. And we said to ourselves, we need to get this out there as far and wide as possible. People need hope. People need to see the way through. People need to see that this is not something happening to us, but perhaps, as Paul has said, it's happening for us. Global warming actually is perfect feedback for a species that's lost its way. In other words, the system is working perfectly. The natural system is working perfectly. It's giving us real serious, real urgent, real comprehensive feedback as a species to have us course correct in a very deep and profound way. And so, yeah. And so this extraordinary message, Drawdown is a book, yes, but it's way more than a book. We consider it a revelation, a gift, a blessing, a kind of a miracle coming just at the right time. And when you engage with the Drawdown material, which you can in the course that'll be offered here by Pachamama Alliance that has been mentioned, or when you just sit and read the book, or when you listen tonight to the panel, to Katharine and Chad, who are part of the Drawdown team, open your heart, not just your mind. Open your soul, not just your brain, to being one of the people who gets this message implanted not only in who you are, but in every living human being you can get this message to. Because ultimately, what this message says is it's not game over, it's game on. It's game on. And I'll just say one more thing, that this last week, a week ago, I guess it's now 2 weeks ago, we participated, as many people probably in this room and listening to this did, in the Global Action Summit that Governor Brown in California put on in San Francisco. And just the fact that that thing happened, that the governor of my state, I live in California, after the United States withdrew from the Paris agreements, said, well, wait a minute, we're not withdrawing. California is going to go for it. We're going to meet those agreements and go beyond them. Who else wants to be in? And he convened 3,000 governors, 3,000 mayors, 3,000 experts, 3,000, all of these people, 3,000 total, people who had the commitment and the wherewithal to not only address those Paris agreements, but go beyond them and come together and have a kind of summit that was about solutions, about progress, about what's working, about how powerfully the world is picking up on this. And it was so positive. And we were lucky enough to bring be part of bringing 40 indigenous peoples from the Amazon, whose voice was woven throughout that conference, throughout that summit. The voice of the forest, the voice of the natural world, the voice of the spirit of life was throughout that conference. And it was so, so, so inspiring to have the indigenous voices not only be heard, but be central to the message of what we can and will do as a human family, as a species who's lost its way, with the guidance, the love, the depth, the spiritual power of our indigenous partners. So I say tonight, once again, be open to be a carrier, an ambassador, a spokesperson for this message and everything that comes with it. Yes, there's huge hurdles in front of us. Yes, it'll take everything to turn the situation around. But knowing that we can, knowing that it's possible, knowing that there's light at the end of the tunnel. I have a friend who says the light at the end of the tunnel is actually a mirror. We're the ones we've been waiting for. We can do it. It's not game over, it's game on. Thank you.
We're going to get closer now to what we used to call the meat and potatoes. I think now we would, the tofu and potatoes of the evening, and really start hearing about some of these remarkable array of solutions and ideas that are coming. And the person who's going to start us down that path is Dr. Katharine Wilkinson. She's Vice President for Communication and Engagement at Project Drawdown, but more importantly, since I'm a writer, she's a fellow writer, the lead writer of Drawdown, a book that really, though technical in ways, was written with enormous fluency and allowed it to become a New York Times bestseller, and really managed to get across with clarity what these possibilities are. She holds a doctorate in geography and environment from Oxford, where she was, in fact, a Rhodes Scholar. And she's going to speak tonight on some of the, she does this all over the world, so she's good at it, but here in New York tonight, going to talk a lot about what the moment holds, what the possibilities are, and as Lynn said, be open to the, it's easy for all of us to convince ourselves that things are impossible, and that's a possibility to hold on to also. We don't know, but be open to the idea that we may really have some possibilities, and if we do, Katharine is one of the people we have to thank for bringing them to light. Katharine Wilkinson.
I have refused to live locked in the orderly house of reasons and proofs. The world I live in and believe in is wider than that. And anyway, what's wrong with maybe? You wouldn't believe what once or twice I have seen. I will just tell you this. Only if you have angels in your head will you ever possibly see one. It's probably not best practice to start a talk about climate, kind of dissing reasons and proofs, but I think these words of Mary Oliver's are so pertinent in this moment. As Lynn was saying, there are days that I really struggle to conjure an angel in my head about the future of our warming world. Some days we are pummeled with bad news, and I feel very small and very sad and quite ashamed. Scientists have done an extraordinary job detailing the problem of global warming, the damage that's already playing out in our climate-changed world, the future that we could face, and what we, I think, as humanity have lacked, and this is the reason for being of Drawdown, we've lacked a comprehensive, compelling, accessible path forward. We have lacked a vision of possibility in the face of this seemingly impossible challenge. These beautiful humans are some of the 60 some odd research fellows that have worked on the project to date from 6 continents and 22 countries, and more starting. We're an international and interdisciplinary collaborative that came together to fill the gap, to map the path forward, and to tell a different side of the story. And together, we have brought to life what we think is a pretty reasonable blueprint of possibility to at least begin to reverse global warming. The critical threshold on that journey is drawdown. The point in time when concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will, we hope, peak and begin to decline on a year-to-year basis. So reducing emissions isn't enough, even though I'm sure that is probably a big part of the discourse this week at Climate Week. Lessening an evil or a difficulty, which is the meaning of the word mitigate, not going to cut it. The goal that makes sense is to get to drawdown, to get to a turning point and head back to the conditions that we know are most conducive for life on this planet. What we discovered as a team at Project Drawdown is that human beings have actually been creating a plan to get to drawdown. We just didn't realize that we had one because we've been out in backyards and fields and forests and companies and schools and halls of government and movements, testing, learning, and trying again. So our job was not to make up a plan. It was to gather and codify the collective wisdom that humanity already holds. And then to bring it into one place, right? This incredible diversity of technologies and practices that are commonly available, scientifically valid, and economically viable. And they range from the usual suspects to unsung heroes and relative unknowns. And they include solutions that avoid sending greenhouse gases up, but also those that bring carbon back home through photosynthesis. This may be one of the solutions that surprised some of you when you dove into Drawdown. Silvopasture comes from the Latin for forest and grazing. It's an ancient practice that is about the integration of livestock and trees. So it's not newfangled technology, and it's advantageous for many reasons that go far beyond emissions. But when you compare a pasture with trees to a pasture without trees, the silvopasture system can sequester 5 to 10 times more carbon and outweigh the methane emissions of ruminants. Silvopasture. And what you see here are some key pieces of the analysis that Chad and our research team did. So the first, of course, is what's the emissions impact that this solution can deliver if scaled globally over 30 years, 2020 to 2050. And it's in gigatons of carbon dioxide. And this is a good slide, I think, to try to conceptualize a gigaton, because a cow is about a ton. So 1 billion cows is a gigaton of cows. And we did a little back of the envelope math. If we put cows side by side by side by side by side, 1 billion cows would fill Rhode Island. Multiply that times 37, and that's the quantity of carbon dioxide we emitted globally last year. I still can't really conceptualize a gigaton, but it's a start. That impact is what drives the ranking. In this case, number 9 out of 80 solutions. And then the team also looked at what's it going to cost to implement these solutions, and what are the savings from operating them. So in this case, there's a financial upside for farmers of almost $700 billion over 30 years. But silvopasture is just one of a system of 80 solutions. They're organized by sector. So they span electricity, food, buildings and cities, transport, materials, land use, and women and girls. And system is really critical. So they're ranked, but it's not because we're going to pick some and lose others. They are interconnected, and all of them are really vital. And there are footholds of action here for every individual and every community and every institution on the planet. I wish I could cover all 100, because I am very attached to all of them, but we will just tour kind of quickly through some, and then I will do a little bit of a deeper dive into the sector shown ever so inventively here in pink, women and girls. Around the world, a third of the food that we produce is not consumed, even as hunger is a condition of life for 800 million people, and even as we are rapidly cutting down forests to grow more food that doesn't get eaten. Reducing food waste from farm to fork is the number 3 solution in Drawdown. Comes in right behind onshore wind turbines at number 2. I love this guy. Electric bikes are the fastest growing alternative fuel vehicle in the world. And electric bikes have emissions advantages over cars, obviously, but even over some forms of mass transit. And they overcome some of the limitations that keep bicycles from being adopted as much as they might be. The ground itself is kind black butter. That's how Seamus Heaney described Irish bogs, and they're layers and layers and layers of decomposing plant matter, which is 50% carbon. Peatlands are just 3% of the Earth's land area, but they hold twice as much carbon as all of the world's forests. So we have this really concentrated opportunity to expand the acreage of protected peatlands, which are under threat from farming, as you can see here, forestry, and fire, as well as to restore those that are degraded. As with onshore wind, offshore wind is a critical solution for replacing our fossil-fueled electricity. We can scale practices that reduce the methane typically generated when we grow rice. Methane is a greenhouse gas that's about 30 times as potent as a heat trapper as carbon dioxide. One of my favorite anecdotes in the book is that the first rooftop solar installation, super prototypical, went up in New York City in 1884. Just using selenium at that time. But the kind of inventor and experimentalist who installed it, this guy Charles Fritz, was absolutely convinced that his photoelectric modules would one day compete with coal-fired power plants. And Thomas Edison had only brought the first one of those online 2 years earlier. So I love this idea that rooftop solar has kind of had dirty coal in its sights all this time. And it's a critical clean energy solution, of course, in places like this, and also for the 1.1 billion people around the world who don't have access to electricity today. Mentioned ruminants and methane. Livestock are responsible for roughly a fifth of global emissions and most of the world's deforestation. So shifting to diets richer in plants and lower in animal protein would have a huge impact, pretty close in magnitude to reducing food waste, not to mention the kinds of upsides we would see for reducing chronic disease and healthcare costs and the like. This is a Kermode bear chowing down on some salmon in the Great Bear Rainforest, which is one of the most kind of incredible success stories around forest protection. Huge opportunity to expand the acreage of protected forests and also to restore tropical and temperate forests that have been degraded or destroyed, which are solutions number 5 and 12, respectively. Oh, the number 1. We can better manage leaks and disposal of the chemical refrigerants that are swirling around in all of our AC systems, cold chains, refrigerators. The opportunity is huge because hydrofluorocarbons are an incredibly potent greenhouse gas, 1,000 times or more as powerful as carbon dioxide. Green and living roofs, as well as cool reflective roofs, are a fantastic opportunity to reduce the energy needs for heating and cooling in our buildings, and at the same time to help cities cope with rising temperatures, extreme heat, and the urban heat island effect. And as I think we'll talk about more on the panel, this is just one piece of a whole suite of solutions that will help us build highly efficient buildings and also to retrofit structures that are already standing. Where land is managed by indigenous people there is much less deforestation and much higher carbon sequestration. And as we know, indigenous communities are often the front lines of resistance against extractive industries. So securing land rights and land tenure can help protect cultures and livelihoods, and it can also have a significant impact on emissions. This is the first of 3 solutions that fall under the sector that we call women and girls, and this is where I want to spend just a little bit more time. The gender-climate nexus is starting, finally, to get more and more attention. Awareness is growing that women are really critical agents of change and often underrepresented at the proverbial table. I shudder to think how many manels will be happening this week at Climate Week. Ours will not be one of them. There's also awareness growing that women and girls suffer the most from the negative impacts of climate change. So for example, in some cases, women and girls comprise up to 90% of those killed in natural disasters. And in conditions of drought, girls are at much greater risk of early marriage, for dowries to help ease household scarcity. On and on and on, there are implications for lives and livelihoods. And what's received less attention, and I hope that our work is helping to shift, is that the solutions are not all gender neutral either. This is one. There's a gender gap in agriculture in lower income countries. There's a gap in the resources that are available to men who work the land and women who do the same. That ranges from land rights, access to capital, credit, extension support, education, technology. Meanwhile, women are producing 60 to 80% of the food in these regions of the world, and many of them are working on less than 5 acres. So while they farm as capably and efficiently as men, because of this inequality in inputs, women smallholders produce less food on the same quantity of land. But with equal access and land rights, their farm yields rise by 20 to 30%. So you can imagine right away, right, the implications for hunger and health and households. But if you have plots of land that are producing more food on the same acreage, there's less need to deforest additional land and put it into production. So this is this incredible example, I think, that addressing this gender gap in agriculture is good for women, it's good for communities, and it's also good for the climate. There's a gender gap in the classroom, and particularly in secondary classrooms around the world. There are more than 130 million girls who are denied the right to attend school. This young woman is not one of them. She is in school in Kenya. High quality education, absolutely vital, right, for higher wages, upward mobility, health outcomes for women and children, greater empowerment, breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty, on and on and on and on. It's hard to name, I think, a better investment than supporting girls' education. It also has a ripple effect on greenhouse gas emissions. What's that about? Women with more years of education choose to have smaller families. It's pretty simple. When you add up that effect across the world and over 3 decades, addressing the right of girls to go to school could end up impacting the number of feet that are making their carbon footprints at mid-century. It's not why we should educate girls, but it happens to be a really, really powerful outcome. Education is one side of a coin, and the other, often there's some hesitancy to talk about, and I don't think that there should be, and that's family planning. This is about closing the gap on access to high-quality, voluntary reproductive health care and contraception. For women to have children by choice rather than chance is a matter of autonomy and dignity. And in the US today, 45% of pregnancies are unintended. There are at least 214 million women around the world who want to be able to manage the size and spacing of their families, and they lack access to contraception. So this is really about addressing the things that women say they need and want and don't have. And it's about advancing empowerment, equality, well-being. These have to be the goals of family planning, just in the way that educating girls begins and ends with rights. And slowing population growth and reducing emissions is a potent side effect. So when you take the integrated impact of educating girls and closing the gap on family planning, it actually turns out that gender equity is the #1 solution to reverse global warming. That's a quick run through 15 solutions. There are 65 more in Drawdown that are already in hand, and another 20 that are on the horizon that we're likely to get some help from in the coming decades. And together they make up this rigorous blueprint of possibility. Reasons and proofs actually did have a very important role to play. And it's a blueprint of possibility to reach Drawdown, obviously, but maybe more importantly, to help us build a more vibrant, more equitable, more resilient living world. And I don't say that to sugarcoat the challenges that we face or the injustices that are already playing out. Our communications manager told me not to cry. She texted me right before. The impacts of climate change are and will be heartbreaking. And I also think that we have a choice about whether our hearts simply break or whether they break open. Broken, open hearts seem to keep us awake. They seem to lead us into action, and to have that action come not from a place of fear or a place of anger, but from the much more powerful place of love. It is a magnificent thing to be alive on the planet at a moment that matters so much. When Mary Oliver's maybe is trembling with significance. So we hope that Drawdown will be a resource and maybe some sustenance for us as we work together and help one another to have and hold and renew and pursue this vision of possibility. I love that banner. One planet, one chance. Let's see if we can take this big evolutionary leap forward as a human species.
All right, thank you, Katharine, so much. Now we're going to start being joined by other people, and I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and then you'll get to know them more as questions go on here. And if you guys could just come up as I call Karen Washington, who's a community activist, and she runs Rise and Root Farm in Chester. I don't know where. Here you are, right next to me. In Chester, and she's also worked with Bronx neighborhoods to turn empty lots into community gardens. She leads workshops on food growing, food justice. I believe that Ebony Magazine named you one of the most 100 influential African Americans that there was. And then James Beard Institute gave you the Leadership Award, probably the only person to have those two distinctions at the same time. So there you are. Lauren Zullo is Director of Sustainability at the Jonathan Rose Companies. That's a big national developer of affordable housing. She used to be at NRDC, but now she works at Jonathan Rose Company on building new and affordable housing that works and is resilient and sustainable, and increasingly working on retrofitting existing housing in the same direction. Chad Frischmann is one of Katharine's colleagues at Project Drawdown. He too has a degree from Oxford, albeit in art history. But never fear, he has a master's degree in public policy from Berkeley as well. And he's really designed a lot of the methodology and the models behind Project Drawdown. So we'll get a little deeper into that. And finally, from very close to home, Dan Zerilli, who runs climate policy for the city of New York. He's the director now of One NYC and sort of thinking about the really large vision for New York going forward. But he's been really crucial in helping Mayor de Blasio position New York as a key part of this climate fight. Last week, the mayor of New York and the mayor of London put out a joint call to all the other cities in the world to divest from fossil fuels, since those are the two biggest financial centers in the world. It was an important announcement because that demonstrated where the smart money was headed. I don't think Dan could have done what he did without some of the organizers in this room helping kind of push in the right direction and create the space, but he moved straight into that space, for which we're very grateful. Now, I'm going to start, if it's okay, Karen, by asking you a question, because let's bring this conversation quickly down to roots, roots of all kinds. You work in communities that are on the front lines of environmental impact, but also you work with literal roots in the ground, growing things about to be harvested this time of year. And so all of this that we're talking about has to kind of pass the test of reality in all kinds of communities. Can you talk a little bit just about how these messages filter down into communities around the world, and talk a little bit about, if you would, the kind of growing urban, growing movement as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. First, thank you for letting me be here today. I've been growing food in New York City for so long, and I think we've reached a point where, and someone had said, we have lost our way. And what I'm seeing now in communities is, especially people who are growing food in communities, especially in low-income communities and communities of color, that they're now understanding that narrative of the indigenous culture that they've come from, and that we have lost our connection to our food system. And what you're seeing around so many inner cities is people starting to get that connection between food and health, food and culture, because when you look at the word agriculture, what has been missing for so long is culture. And people, there's a yearning for people, especially young people, to go back into that realm of culture and using that force, that indigenous knowledge on how to grow better not only for their family, but for their environment. And the things that they're doing is, besides composting, but they're understanding the relationship in seed saving, which is so important and has been marketed. Can you believe it, that we've allowed a company to patent our seeds, and seeds are our DNA? They're also looking at intercropping and growing companion fruits and vegetables to bring beneficial insects so that they don't have to use pesticides and insecticides which are harming their family. And so there's a wealth of information that's out there that people who are sometimes deemed powerless are now becoming powerful, and they want a seat at the table. They want to get involved in this climate movement. They understand that there's one planet. They just need a chance and an opportunity to come in and have their voices heard. And I'm so glad for people to realize that, this country was not built on fossil fuels. It was not built on the Industrial Revolution. It was built on simplicity of people learning about nature and learning about culture. And I think the young people in our community are starting to realize that they want to go back, like you said, to their roots and understand that we have one planet. And if we're not all vested in it with one voice, with one recollection, then how do we move forward as a society?
Amen. Karen, that's very powerful, and it lets us to turn to Chad, if it's okay for a minute, Chad, to talk, now bring us out to a kind of larger level. One of the things that Drawdown talks a lot about is food security. Maybe this is a good chance to kind of begin by talking about the kind of larger methodology and how on earth one arrives at these remarkably specific figures for how many gigatons of carbon we're pulling out, and then use the food system as a kind of example to talk about some of the possibilities and about food security too.
Well, first of all, we started looking around the world to see what already existed. And there's a lot of global systems models, there's a lot of integrated assessment models, general equilibrium models out there. But we struggled to find those that really had a bottom-up, solutions-oriented, and agency perspective. And by agency, we mean decision makers. Whether you're an individual or a policymaker, a city planner, a farmer, a building owner. And so I recall early days when we first started, and it was just a few of us together. And Paul Hawken asked me, I want you to build a model that can do the math on the solutions to reverse global warming. And I looked around the room and I said, okay, let's see about that. I didn't think it was possible. But he said, we can do this only when it's a collaborative group of people coming together to do this research and writing and putting this together. Suddenly, I realized it is possible to do this and to collect the best available information and data on what's already happening. And so we built these global systems models, ground up, solutions-oriented, agency perspective, that gives us a tool to really understand what's possible, but that is in a way that's functional, that is meaningful, useful, doesn't require a PhD or a couple master's degrees, art history or not, to open up the file, right? We wanted to create a tool that was capable of aggregating, collecting that knowledge, and presenting results that we could all act upon. So you asked for the food system, but that's a rather oddball, so I'm going to actually describe the other ones first, if that's okay. First of all, really, we collect a lot of data. And we use statistical analysis to create ranges from which we make reasonable choices for every input that we put into this model. And we take a conservative approach. If we have any bias, it's conservative. And all that data is entered into the models, ambitiously and plausibly projected into the future, and just compared against what we would have to do anyway. When we think about onshore wind turbines or geothermal energy, this is about the electricity generated compared to what we would have to do anyway with coal or gas-fired plants. And so that process is used to compare recycling and landfilling, regenerative and versus industrial agriculture, protecting versus cutting down our trees. So then these results are added up. First I should say they're integrated within and across systems, and then they get added up to see if we even get to drawdown. So we didn't actually go there to optimize this, to get to drawdown. We let the numbers, the data, speak for itself, and we can get there. As Katharine showed us, it's possible. Food system was a rather oddball, because what we tried to do with building these other types of models that looked at markets of functional demand and different allocations of land use and agroecological zones, thermal moisture regimes, is to create a consistent model that could allow us to evaluate any technology and practice at global scale. Food system is rather complicated because it involves billions and billions of people's consumption patterns, different commodities, different countries, different dietary practices, and has to be compared against a business as usual that shows an increasing decrease of plant-rich diets in favor of animal-based proteins, or increased animal-based proteins that are common in Western diets. So we had to build a really different model because there are hundreds of thousands of data inputs that are used in that. But essentially what that is doing is comparing a world in the future where we're seeing an increased consumption of animal-based proteins based very much on the Western diet compared to a plant-rich diet, which is roughly, it's not a vegetarian or a vegan diet, though I applaud anybody who make those choices. A plant-rich diet is a healthy diet in terms of how much we consume and how much meat is consumed. So we compare and contrast a world in which we have much higher animal-based protein consumption compared to that plant-rich diet, and we add that up. Now, the interesting thing about this is when we do all the math behind all the agricultural production solutions, like regenerative agriculture or silvopasture, which Katharine referenced, we adopt a plant-rich diet, and we reduce our food waste at a global scale. Our research shows that we would produce enough food on current farmland to feed the world's growing population a healthy, nutrient-rich diet, now until 2050 and beyond, without having to cut down any forest. So the solutions to reversing global warming are the same solutions to food insecurity.
Does the technical analysis imply a kind of set of political outcomes too? For instance, Karen works hard on small-scale local agriculture, and that's been amazing to watch in embryo around this country in the last decade, emerging a kind of local food movement. And of course, much of the world still retains a kind of peasant-based agriculture in many places. Is Drawdown agnostic on whether we have in a world of corporate-based giant farms or small farms run by people, or how does that work?
Well, I say, we're agnostic in the sense that we don't take an innate political bias, but we show the many different types of solutions that are available both for industrial scale or large farming operations as well as smallholder farmers. And you have to remember that still very much of the world's food is produced by smallholder farmers. We research over 13 different regenerative agricultural practices, and there are many more actually that are viable. But these aren't new ways of doing things. These have been practiced for centuries and generations and are still practiced by indigenous communities and local communities all over the world. But they're being increasingly displaced by modern agriculture, which encourages tillage and monocropping and the use of industrial fertilizers and pesticides, and this degrades the land, turns into a net emitter. So by virtue of putting these regenerative solutions out there that are actually applicable to smallholder farmers and large farming operations, I wouldn't say we take a particular bias, we're agnostic to it, but clearly we need to be supporting smallholder farmers and to continue to allow them to be, or not allow them, but to continue to reinforce the possibility for them to continue working the land the way they've been practiced for centuries, for generations, and not to displace them.
That sounds highly political to me.
It could be. I take it agnostic.
That's a very good answer. Lauren, we're going to turn to you as the representative of the world's building stock here. We basically do only a certain number of things that produce almost all the carbon emissions around us. We eat, we travel around and move things around, and we live in buildings that require heating and cooling and things. And you work for someone who builds lots of buildings and manages lots of buildings. What should we be thinking about, and how should we be thinking perhaps about how some of these things like transportation integrate with buildings, or agriculture with building stock, or whatever else? Take us on a little tour.
Sure. Excited to represent all the buildings in the world tonight. I'm excited to be here because I have been in the building space for a long time, and the energy efficiency space, and often it's talking about ROI and financial returns, but this is an exciting panel for me to be on because there's so many diverse views represented here, and as Bill is saying, everything is so interconnected, and I think we see buildings and cities really as the space where all of this is coming together. Transportation, the building sector, how we eat and grow and bring our food into the cities. And so it's a really important question, and in the US, the energy used to heat, cool, and power our buildings, charge your iPhones, is about 40% of the energy produced. And so it's a big challenge. And the way we approach building new buildings from the ground up is to think really comprehensively. One of the most important decisions you can make is where your building is located. So we focus on transit-oriented development, locating our buildings where our residents will have access to mass transit, walkable communities, bikeable communities. And then from there, it's interesting to even call it technology because there are so many building strategies that really sort of hark back to our earliest days. The way a building is oriented, whether it catches more sun in the wintertime to keep it warm and less sun in the summertime to keep it cool. Those orientation or massing strategies are really important. Think also about old buildings or little Scottish houses that were built a long time ago. You had really thick walls, or maybe you had a sod roof. All of these strategies help keep heat out in the summer and keep the building warm in the winter. And so there are things like that, different strategies for getting light into the buildings when you want it in there and keeping it out when you don't, that really go back to the way things used to be. And a lot of what we're doing today is figuring out ways to design efficiently using materials that aren't polluting, and bringing those buildings to life in cities where they've never necessarily been built before. We do have a really exciting project here in New York City that we're designing currently up in East Harlem. It's a full city block, and I think it's really kind of a showcase of all of these strategies coming together. We call it Sendero Verde. It's 100% affordable housing. So we're building it in partnership with New York City's Housing and Preservation. And it's designed to what's called passive house standards. And passive house is all about creating a really thick insulation so that you can use, in theory, this building will use 80% less energy than a typically designed building today. So we're really excited about this. On this property, the full city block, we also will have community partners. So Mount Sinai will have a health clinic there. There's going to be an on-site daycare. There's going to be a charter high school. And that's the goal for that is really to bring in all of the services and community partners that can help activate our residents and provide them with the life opportunities that we'd like them to see and that will help them achieve their greatest health and education outcomes. And we also have 3 community gardens on site. And one of our priorities as we look to retrofit and renovate and bring affordable housing communities to life across the country has been really centered around community gardens. We find it one of the most effective ways to activate our communities, create relationships amongst residents, to build a sense of trust and a sense of safety. We've seen a lot of kind of intergenerational relationship building through the programming that we do around the community gardens that help bring different generations together, but also kind of activates this sort of notion of healthy eating and understanding what an active and healthy lifestyle can look like. So that's something we're really proud of across our portfolio.
Well, it sounds great. And it leads into the next question for Dan. Speaking of questions, I see people with baskets walking around collecting cards, so if you have one, just let them know, and we'll get them up. I just hold them up until people come by. Dan, the kind of stuff that Lauren works on, or the kind of stuff that Chad and Katharine have been describing, is incredibly powerful only if it goes to scale, and given that climate change is a time test, it only really helps if it goes to scale fast. So, I mean, it's probably true that in a rational world, it might be easiest to deal with this at a international or national level, but it's abundantly clear that, at least for the moment, we're not going to do that in this country anyway. So you're charged with figuring it out. You've got the biggest city in the country, and in some ways the most important city in the world, and you're now in charge of figuring out how to make these kind of ideas go very quickly to scale. What tools do you have to work with? How do the rest of us support you in that work? How does it look to you?
We have New Yorkers is what we have to help us. I want to first just say that one, sometimes against my better judgment, I'm an optimist in this space, and I want to thank the folks at Drawdown for actually putting the rigor and the math behind that type of optimism. That's, I think, really what we need when we think about solutions. And it's a great question. How do we take these solutions to scale as quickly as possible? And part of it is, I think, a technocratic answer, and we're a city that was shaken to its core from climate change. On that night, in 2012, when Hurricane Sandy rode ashore and 44 lives were lost and $19 billion in damages were felt and seen here in New York City. And I think it caused a wholesale change in how we think about climate change. And no longer did we have the illusion of thinking that climate change was going to be something that's going to happen 100 years from now to someone far, far away. It's here and it's now. And it caused us to really think about the many ways in which we have to respond if we're going to maintain the city and protect New Yorkers and be that beacon to the rest of the world that I think so many other places look to here in New York City. Well, first, we're adapting, and we're spending over $20 billion in the types of protections that we know we're needing because we've locked in too much change here with flood protection and heat mitigation and a number of other things where we are investing in our neighborhoods and investing in inclusive climate action so that what we're doing works for all New Yorkers across all of our neighborhoods. Two, we're committed to the Paris Agreement. When President Trump recklessly announced his intention to withdraw, Mayor de Blasio immediately stood up and said, that's not going to work here. We are committed to the principles and goals of the Paris Agreement. We're going to be accelerating our own actions. We had been committed to an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. We're going to take that even further and go as fast as we can, and have been working with the City Council on a really bold set of retrofit mandates. We're investing in electric vehicles. We're leading by example by doing that, which I think is an important part of the answer to your question, Bill, around how we're greening our own fleet. We have 1,200 electric vehicles in the city's fleet, 500 charging stations. Now we're helping take that out into the private sector, and we're investing in fast charging solutions in all of our neighborhoods. We are also looking. Thank you. I definitely think there are ways where we can lead by example. We can be retrofitting our own buildings. We can be pushing for greener fleets. I think there's lots of solutions that we need to continue to work with New Yorkers to make sure that we can scale up. Then I think there's an element of we need to change the conversation. We need to send a signal that fossil fuels need to stay in the ground. We're divesting. Mayor de Blasio, New York City Controller Scott Stringer, we committed in January that we are going to be divesting our pension funds from fossil fuels. It's $5 billion we're going to be taking out of an industry that we know is causing so much destruction. At the same time, we've taken 5 of those largest investor-owned fossil fuel companies to court. We need to make sure that they are sharing in the cost that we're already seeing and helping protect New Yorkers. Now, of course, our first judge didn't see it that way and kicked us out of court, but we're appealing. We're going to take this as far as we go because we know it's incredibly important to provide climate accountability in this conversation. And Third, we are investing in climate solutions. We know that we need to divest, we need to get our money out of a dying industry, we need to be investing in climate solutions, and we've set a new standard for pension funds. We're putting 2% of our assets into climate solutions, not just low carbon industries, climate solutions, wind and solar. That adds up to $4 billion here in New York City. That may be a small piece of what is needed globally, but we've done some math that even if just 50 of the biggest pension funds in the United States were to set those 2% aside, it would be enough to solarize half of the homes in this country. So we need others to join us, and there's a key point here that we are calling on, and Bill, you mentioned this, that we are calling on other cities to join us in divesting, in investing in climate solutions, because the power of cities coming together, the power of pension funds and moving finance sends a strong, not only financial signal, it sends a moral signal that we need to get out of fossil fuels, we need to keep them in the ground. And I think that sets the stage for larger scaling up of solutions. We need to change the conversation. We need to change the actual facts on the ground of what we're willing to do with our money, the choices we make with our own investments, the choices we make in our own lives. And that's what allows the space, the political space for sure, the space in our own lives to make different choices so that we can envision an actually a different future for us, for our kids, for our nation, for the world. So thank you.
Dan, I just really want to say publicly how grateful the environmental movement is for the work that the mayor and you have done over the last 6 or 8 months. It's been incredibly energizing around the world and really helped, and I think in New York as well. But Karen, let's assume you've been in New York a while too. So let's assume that the day comes when Dan's not here anymore and there's a new mayor and so on and so forth. Talk a little bit about how it is that we, in your view, kind of keep pressure on institutions to keep moving, open up the space for them to do the right thing or keep them from doing the wrong thing. And I mean, there are examples now of things that are hard. I mean, I know the composting program in New York is a place that needs that kind of push.
I think what Dan said was very important. We are New Yorkers, and we just don't sit down. We demand answers, and we demand accountability. I think you see this new movement that's getting away from complacency. I think complacency killed us back in the day. And so you see this new push for community organizing and activism, and people going out, making sure that their political people are accountable for the things that affect their community. So you see this uprise of especially new voices coming out, making sure that they know who their district managers are, who their city council people are, who their assembly people are, who their state senate people are, who their congressmen people are. I know all those people. And so it's up to everyone in this audience to take that responsibility to get to know who your political people are, because at the end, they work for us and not vice versa.
Brad or Katharine, since we're here in one of the great metropolises on the planet, talk a little bit about cities in general and how they fit into this story. I mean, New York is renowned in certain ways as being among the greenest places in the States simply by virtue of the fact that it anyway used to have a working subway system and very efficient transit and things. But urban life seems like it's where the planet is headed in more and more and more. What do we need to do to make sure that that's a good thing, not a bad one?
Well, I'll start, and of course, Katharine, jump on in any time. So that's absolutely correct. I mean, the urban settings are increasingly going to see larger and larger populations moving towards urban environments. We see this trend in the future. And the built environment becomes an incredibly important solution when we look at it as a system in and of itself. Buildings, transportation, waste management, food systems, all of these are integrated within the built environment. And so it does become increasingly important. And while buildings per se, when we're thinking about urban environments, you often think about these buildings, reflect a relatively small amount of the total amount of emissions that are reduced in the Drawdown, book. But that's because they are so much integrated within the rest of the system. And we also take a conservative approach in that. But I think there are a tremendous role for cities to take a leading action in transforming and accelerating these solutions at that scale. I mean, municipalities are incredibly important in initiating policies and creating mechanisms that can support these, whether it's mass transit or walkable cities and city planning, or regulations at the municipal scale that can have a tremendous influence on adoption of these building measures. So I think it's incredibly important. But maybe you want to add a little bit more on the next steps?
Yeah, I might just add that, I think Lauren and Karen and Dan, what you have been talking about is such a good example of also the way in which cities will be the places where we smash up really delightfully against the co-benefits of climate solutions, right? Whereas, there are some that we might never encounter, but in cities, maybe no one's actually getting their hands dirty in the community garden, but people are aware, and it's shifting the norms, and we know what it feels like to walk down a street and not be choking on diesel fumes. And, so I think that they are laboratories of the solutions, certainly, but also the many, many positive ripple effects that come out of this suite of action.
So Dan, you're charged into this one NYC with really figuring out sort of where we're going. City builders before you had the luxury of, if you're, designing Brasilia or someplace, you kind of start fresh. And New York City is as built an environment as it's possible to be. Every inch of it is covered with something. Is it really possible to imagine it transformed, do you think, in the course of the next few decades? And how do we do the work of kind of inspiring people? And maybe this is a place where Lynn can weigh in too. It's sort of easier to get people excited about building something new from the beginning. How do we inspire people around the task of taking that which we have already and transforming it?
I would certainly love to hear your thoughts on this, Lynn. This is a city that has continued to change and evolve over its 400 and some years of history, where we continue to reinvent ourselves. And so this is a chance to think about how we want to reinvent ourselves for the greatest, probably existential challenge that we will face as a city. And especially as a coastal city, we will feel the impacts of climate change directly here on our shores, and we will feel it in the heat, and we will feel it with rain and all of those impacts, and that will have ripple effects across our whole society. We need to imagine what this future looks like, and we need to figure out how to get there together. That's what this process is really about. If you'll allow me a plug, everyone out here who's asking questions and may want to even direct them at me about what we should be doing and how we should be thinking about building a better New York City, go to nyc.gov/1NYC. There's a button, take a survey, tell us what you think. I know New Yorkers aren't shy. Pull it up on your phone and do it right now while you're asking that question to us, and we'll get it into the queue, and certainly we want to hear from everybody. We'd love to hear your thoughts, Lynn.
Well, I'll just say, I think we need to hear this kind of news more of it. And, I think we don't actually live in the world or live in our cities or live in our lives the way we think. We live in the conversation we have about the world. We live in the conversation we have about our cities. We live in the conversation we have about our lives. And that's malleable. The conversation is completely malleable. And when the conversation shifts, people's actions shift, and people's perceptions shift, and people's way of living shifts. And to me, there's an opportunity for the movement for this transformation to see itself growing and succeeding And when a movement sees itself growing and succeeding, that's actually when it flips. That's when it becomes what's happening. So I say that the kind of conversation we're having here tonight, I mean, it's so inspiring to listen to you. I can't even, I had no idea about, I love San Francisco. I live in San Francisco. San Francisco's totally cool, but nothing compared to New York. I mean, what you're doing in New York, and New York is like, everybody watches New York. New York is the media center of the world. It's the financial center of the world. Now can it be the sustainable, transformational center of the world for everything that we all know needs to happen? And it sounds like it is. And I love hearing this news. I love it. I love hearing about community gardens. I love hearing about what Jonathan Rowe's company is doing. It's just awesome. And we need to find a way to share this. The media just doesn't seem to like anything too positive. Have you noticed that lately? But to get in a conversation where we start to see, God, we can win this game. In fact, we are winning this game. And we're hospicing the death of the old structures and systems that no longer serve us. We're letting them die their natural death. They're unsustainable, they're dying, and we can hospice their death. Things that are hospice die faster and with a little bit of dignity, while we midwife the birth of the structures and systems that we know are accurate and appropriate and what we need and want now. And that's really what you're sharing. And to allow that, that natural love to flourish, that's really what this is all about. I think Katharine said the most powerful force in the world is love. And when you talk about what you're doing and how excited you are, I mean, your body's all vibrating, everybody's cheering. We love hearing about that stuff. And I say that we need to find ways to share it more, share it with each other, and be the harbingers of the good news rather than the bad news.
So that seems exactly right. Let's talk about how that manifests. There's a number of questions up here that I've gotten that are sort of along the same lines, and they begin with a question that I hear often. If you were to ask each person listening to do one thing, what would that be? But that question gets sharpened, I think, by others who say, is that actually the right frame to be asking? Does it make sense to think of tackling this problem primarily as individuals or primarily as members of a larger society, as political animals who come together to make change happen? When you read the math, when you think about it, and remembering that this is a timed test, unlike other challenges that we've faced as a species, what's your sense? Are we smart to think about this as individuals, or is that kind of a trap? Anybody can.
I hate the what's the one thing I can do question. Because we are all so different and we have such different gifts and talents to bring to this space, and because one thing is never going to be enough. There are a whole host of reasons, and I think it's really a shame, I think, that for so many years so much of the messaging out of the environmental movement emphasized this individual behavior change, right? Like, we could change light bulbs all day long, and that's not going to get us to drawdown. We need to change light bulbs. And I think people get that, right? When it's like, here's this massive challenge, and here's this tiny thing I'd like you to do. People are kind of like, that seems like BS to me, frankly. And I think you're right, Bill, in terms of the scale and the time test. We have to be coming together in collectives in all sorts of ways around all sorts of things. And I think that thinking about the collectives that we are already a part of and how those collectives can be mobilized, as well as the collectives we might join, I think both of those are really, really important. To kind of just put a point on the individual behavior change, Mary Robinson and Maeve Higgins have this amazing new podcast called Mothers of Invention. Shameless plug, it's so good. And Maeve and I were having this debate about individual action, and she was like, but what if I do all these things and I have this evil twin who's doing just the opposite? It was like, yes. And if you really play out the logic, the best thing we could do would all be to die. Right? And then it's like, okay, maybe that's not quite the way to think about it.
That's not the final page of Drawdown. It's not.
And everyone, yeah. Maeve was like, that is the rudest thing anyone's ever said to me. So yes, collectives, but I think Frederick Buechner is a theologian whose work I like. And he's writing about vocation as the place where one's deep gladness and the world's deep need meet. And I think, again, in the environmental space, we can sort of go on and on and on and on and on about the world's deep need, oh my God, the deep need. And I think the question also is not just what should I do, but what can I do with an immense amount of joy? Because I think we need to be thinking as much about these less quantifiable accelerants more than we have.
Well, Lauren, let's keep talking about accelerants for a minute, because you're doing, Rose Company is developing all over the country, lots of interesting projects, but you probably are able to do them most effectively in places where people have gone and done the work to get mandates passed about or subsidies put in place or so on. Talk about that a little bit.
Right, absolutely. I think, change is hard. How many of you take a new commute to work just because you want to try it out? It's not something that we do. We get into routine and we, like to do the same thing over and over because we're comfortable with it and we know how it feels and we know what the outcomes will be. And first, I think to this question about, is it an individual action or a collective action? One kind of concrete example that we just experienced recently, we were designing a building and we wanted to introduce a compost system. So from the start, we wanted to make sure that the building had the space for it and the structures for it. And so I'm sitting in a room with architects, engineers, owners, there's a tenant group there. And we're, green real estate. We're designing this super green, cool building. And we start talking about compost and everyone says, ooh, the bugs, the smells, and got scared. And so in my office, I introduced a organics waste collection program. And so now we have compost bins in our office. Thanks. And it sounds like a small move, but people were then able to see it and do it and smell it and got comfortable with it. And now we're designing our buildings to this. And so the best thing actually that I hear too is the people who have gone home and are composting at home or dropping their things at the green markets. And I think that's really exciting. So it's individual action informing collective action, and vice versa. And, thinking about kind of how to do this across the country and at scale, I think it does start with the individuals. There are so many kind of lifestyle choices that create just an environment of excitement around sustainability and excitement around environmental movement and change that allows cities and utility programs and states to start to take steps that enable further environmental action. And so we're really lucky working in New York or almost anywhere up and down the East Coast to have a plethora of utility incentives that can help us invest deeply in energy efficiency retrofits or water conservation. And there are really financial incentives there that help us do the work, because as affordable housing owners and operators, we're operating on tight margins. And so those political choices or state policy choices really help enable work at scale. And that starts with the people kind of coming together to demand that from their governments. We work in places where that movement isn't as strong, and the states haven't put the right policy conditions in place. And fossil fuel companies are charging, bottom dollar for electricity, and it's really difficult to make the financial case for investments in energy efficiency retrofits. And so we're challenged in certain parts of the country to do the right thing, and then other areas make it more easy because of their policy decisions. So we're thrilled to be doing most of our ground up development here in New York, which has really put its money where its mouth is, thanks to Dan's work and others, and is helping us in the private sector invest in and do the right thing.
I think it's very important to sort of understand that mix of how money follows policy and how it opens up space. We have, just to give, someone points out that there's a sort of very good example at hand today of what happens when policy goes wrong. The number one recommendation in Drawdown is refrigeration management. Earlier today, the Trump administration reversed the long-standing rules on HFCs, on refrigerants, and is back to work trying to, obviously job 1, 2, and 3 is somehow get rid of the Trump administration, whenever that happens. But in the hopefully short meantime, how does the city of New York make sure that this doesn't, we don't spend the next 2 years people doing dumb things around refrigeration or whatever it is that you'll then have to go and remove? And how does that look on a kind of global scale, Chad?
I think there's a first answer we've come together with other cities and other states and AGs on many of these sort of, what's the latest reckless thing the Trump administration is doing? Well, we've been taking them to court, whether it's protecting the CAFE standards, whether it's protecting the Clean Power Plan. Perhaps now it's about HFCs that we're going to have to assemble the same coalition. But I think there's plenty of opportunity for us to push back in the courts. There's plenty of opportunity to then look at our own tools and powers that we have locally on what we can do. So I don't necessarily know the exact answer on that one, but I think there's a lot of levers that we have to pull, and litigation is a key one that we've been certainly not reluctant to use.
Just amplify that for a minute. I think one of the things that we fall into and is sometimes the sense that the decisions we're going to make about the future are entirely based on reason, and if we only knew what the right, and it is worth remembering all the time that this is also, it's not just an argument, it's a fight, and there are people and forces on the other side of that fight who are busy trying to make sure that we don't do the things that need doing. So there are oil companies that are fighting hard to make sure that we keep building fossil fuel infrastructure and pipelines in New York City, New York State. There are, chemical manufacturers somehow clinging to the idea that they'd like to go back to making HFCs for refrigerant, on and on and on. And I think this gets to the question we talked about earlier about, individual action. And when people ask me that question, I tend to say the most important thing an individual can do is not be quite so much of an individual, come together with other people to form the sort of movements that get us someplace. But I think that this is a kind of perfect example of both the possibility and the fact that merely enunciating the possibility is insufficient to get us where we need to go. Lynn, you had...
I just want to bring business into this conversation because individual transformation is really important. Individual action, individual commitment, individual will. Only an individual can create will, and the will is key. But it's also really important community. Community is a huge part of sustaining will and sustaining individual commitment. Without community, individual will and commitment starts to fade, starts to get weakened, starts to get shy. But institutions have a huge role to play here, so it's on all levels, I would say. And one of the institutions that has so much power and so much opportunity is business. I mean, business is really the largest institution on earth now, bigger than governments now. And the kinds of things that you talk about with the Rose Company and the things you're talking about have a lot to do with business waking up to the role that they can play. And, you know, Raj Sisodia is here, the founder of Conscious Capitalism. These movements like Conscious Capitalism, like B Corps, if we can really get behind that, a business has such a gigantic impact on the world, on millions of people who work in companies, and if these businesses wake up to their responsibility and start to be conscious, which is what Conscious Capitalism does, and other entities like that, we have a real shot. I think that's an important element of the conversation, and how we use money. The way you talked about how we're using money. Money really has a huge role here, and when money starts to move away from the darkness and towards the light, people follow, action follows, institution follows, communities follow, and the change is imminent. So
that's a good point to make. Karen, you're the only person up here on stage who actually runs a for-profit business. And it's one that is all about people making choices about consumption. I mean, the easiest thing for everyone to keep doing is what we've done for the last 100 years, which is find the single cheapest thing to eat that it's possible to find and buy it and put it. What do you tell people when you're trying to make them understand why we need to be shifting that paradigm a little?
As a for-profit farm, we need to educate people the cost and value of food. And that's a conversation that we don't have. I live in a low-income neighborhood, and you see poverty and hunger all around. And the fact is that we're in one of the greatest countries in the world, but yet why do we have so much waste of food? And why is it that we have an abundance of food in terms of it not getting down to the people that need it the most? We grow enough food. We waste enough food. But yet we need to really talk about the cost and value of food, because many times food has been looked in terms of charity. And when food is looked at charity, people don't understand there's a cost and value behind it. Behind the person that puts that seed in the ground, that travels through distribution, that lands on your plate. There's a cost and value in terms of labor, in terms of social capital. And that's something that we don't talk about. I also want to bring in, when we talk about community, because that's why we have community gardens, because you can't grow food by yourself. It takes a community. But recently I had a conversation with a lot of our faith-based organizations that are now starting to come into this climate change and global movement, because they understand within their parishioners, be it the synagogues, be it the churches, be it the mosques, that they too play a role in climate change, and understanding that their parishioners are affected by it. So now you're seeing not only just regular people talking about it, but it takes a community. And when you talk about food as a farmer, food intersects so much. So we're partnering not with other foodies, but with housing, and with education, and with environment, and with health. And so with this intersections, it brings us full circle on what's important. Again, this work we cannot do alone. We can't work in silos. And I think in the past, that's been our downfall. People think that they can take it upon themselves. It's the I movement, but it's not the I movement, it's the we movement. And I think that's just starting to see change.
And I will say, Karen, that Rise and Root Farm sells it one day a week at the Green Market in Union Square and one day a week at Farmers Market in the Bronx. And those are different places and different questions and different, but they have some things in common too.
Everybody has a right to food that is fresh, that is local, Food is a right for all, not a privilege for some.
And that statement goes back, I think, we're drawing to a close here, and that's probably a good way to do it, because that goes back to a kind of theme that underlies Project Drawdown. It was born, this book and this project, out of the fear that we're, the correct fear that we're in grave danger as a planet. But it was also born out of the sense that the answer to that grave danger could yield us a planet that works much more beautifully than the one we're on now. And so as we end here tonight, first of all, let me say that being New Yorkers, Dan, they've supplied you with a long list of action items that you're to go to work on, and I will get them to you. Reflective windows on buildings, new fossil fuel infrastructure, which is a very bad idea, a number of other things, and we'll make sure you have them. So thank you for that. Second thing is, everybody has by now, I hope, filled out those postcards, and there's going to be a block, because $200 billion in New York State pension funds is no small sum of money, and there's real leverage there. The third thing is, for sale out there in the lobby, there are Drawdown books, but more importantly, the opportunity to sign up for this course and go deeper into these questions. But the fourth thing is just to say enormous thanks. I think that it's, you know, one sees a lot of discussions of this kind, but it's rare that we get the chance to really telescope in and out, to talk about things at the most global level, to talk about them at the most rooted level, and to talk about them at those absolutely crucial intermediate scales where we figure out the policies, we figure out the plans that will, on the one hand, allow people to do great work at the bottom, and at the other hand, someday, perhaps pay off in kind of global terms. So for me, this has been an extremely rich and interesting evening, and I want to thank all of you very much for taking part in it. And now, just so you have another beautiful vision in your minds as we leave, we're going to finish with just a very short video about Drawdown and about the Pachamama Alliance.